Right then, I think we'll make a start. Good afternoon everyone, my name is Matthew Keep. I work in the economics section of the library, and today I'm going to talk about the Barnett formula. So I'm going to cover what's the point of the formula, what does it do, what doesn't it do, how it works. I'm going to discuss needs, spending per head and convergence, and lastly I'm going to speak about the future of Barnett, particularly in relation to recent devolution. So firstly, what's the point of the Barnett formula? Well, the Barnett formula calculates funding for devolved administrations. Specifically, it calculates the annual change in the block grant, which is the main source of revenue for the devolved governments. It was introduced in the late 70s, early 80s by the then Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Joel Barnett, later Lord Barnett. The reason it was introduced was so that the Chief Secretary no longer had to negotiate these particular budgets. Each year he was negotiating budgets for UK government departments. By introducing the formula, there was no need to enter into further negotiations over the Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish budgets. So what does it do, what doesn't it do? So as I've said already, it calculates changes in the block grants, which is the main source of revenue for devolved governments. It doesn't calculate the actual amount, the total amount. All it does is take the previous year's block grant and then work out how much extra it should get, each devolved government should get the next year. So it's always working out annual changes. It aims to give the same pounds per head change in funding to each devolved government as the change in funding for UK government departments. So in pounds per head, the same change. It doesn't, as I've said, recalculate the total block grant each time. It's simply the change from one year to the next. Also, it doesn't calculate the funding for all areas of devolved budgets. So for instance, the Barnett formula doesn't work for annually managed expenditure. This is expenditure which is demand driven, such as perhaps student loans. Those sorts of elements are negotiated between the governments. Also, it doesn't calculate EU structural funds. These are provided by the EU to the UK government and then divided up amongst the devolved governments. So there are elements that aren't determined by the Barnett formula. Also, it doesn't provide a statutory basis. There's no legislation about the Barnett formula. It's all laid out in the Statement of Funding Policy. So this is the Treasury document, the Statement of Funding Policy. It's updated generally whenever there's a big spending review. And in it talks about the workings of the Barnett formula. It's updated at spending reviews because this is when the Barnett formula is mainly used as part of the spending review. So moving on, how does it work then? How does the Barnett formula work? So the formula takes changes for each UK government department, their budgets, in particular their DELs, so their departmental expenditure limits. These are the kind of day-to-day budgets of government departments which are predictable and can be controlled by the UK government. It then adds in a comparability percentage. This looks at how the proportion of spending by the UK government department on devolved areas. So how comparable the services provided by the UK government department are with those provided by each of the devolved governments. It then adds in a population proportion. This looks at the population of the devolved government you're interested in relation to the population served by the UK government department. And I'll move on to an example here. But essentially these three items are all multiplied together for each UK government department. What results is the Barnett consequential. Each of these Barnett consequentials are summed together, added to the previous year's block grant. Then you have your block grant for whichever devolved government you're interested in. So moving on to an example here. This is how part of Scotland's block grant for 2016-17 was calculated. So first of all, we see the change to the planned UK government spending. So here, these are UK government departments, education, health, communities, etc. In the first column of numbers, we see what they were receiving in 15-16. We then see what the spending review allocated for 16-17, and then we can see the change. So for education, there was an increase of 0.8 billion in 16-17. The next element we need to add in is the comparability percentage. So these are the comparability percentages used in the most recent spending review for each government department. And as I say, they measure the percentage of spending by the UK government department that is on areas which are devolved. I will show you how that's calculated now as well, actually. So looking at the Home Office, this is an example of how the comparability percentage for the Home Office was calculated. So first of all, the Home Office's spend is divided up into various programmes, so administration, border force, etc. And then their provision, so what they would expect to spend in 15-16. Then comparability percentages are added for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and these look at a programme level whether a similar service is provided by the Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Irish Government. Then the provision is multiplied by the comparability. So for administration, 728 times by 100 for Scotland, so you end up with 728 for Scotland's calculation. And this carries on for each programme. At the end, these are summed up, so each of these summed up to give a total amount, which is then divided by the Home Office's total spending to give this flavour of the kind of proportion of spending which is on devolved areas.
Does the percent mean Scotland?
Yeah.
Does all its own Home Office administration?
This would either be 100% or 0%. There's nothing in between. What it means is that Scotland has a service which is comparable on administration.
Right. Scotland doesn't do any border force in itself. Devolved powers, is that?
Yes, that would be right. Now there are other reasons why 0% might be given. The first reason is if spending is determined outside the block grant. So there are examples where a particular budget may be determined outside of the Barnett formula. In that case, we'd see a 0%. The other case where we'd see a 0% is if the particular programme is deemed to be unique at the UK level. So something that not only is it not provided by Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, there would be no need for them to ever do that. So the UK Channel Tunnel was kind of a classic example of these UK-wide projects. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So that's how a comparability percentage is worked out. So that then goes into the formula, so we'll see these different comparabilities for each different UK government department. The final part then is the appropriate population proportion, and this is the population of the particular devolved government you're interested in compared to the region that is served by the UK government department. So we throw those in, and you'll see generally in this example for Scotland they're 9.85%, because it's Scotland as a percentage of England's population. There are a few 9.31%. In this case, it's Scotland as a percentage of England and Wales's population, because there's different territorial areas served by those departments. So we take these three elements, multiply them together for each department, so the green elements, and then we can see in yellow the Barnett consequential arising from each of those departments. These are then summed together, added to Scotland's previous year block grant, and then you've got the block grant for the current year for Scotland. Now, as I said, this mainly happens at the spending review, but of course the UK government may decide that it wants to spend more on a particular service outside of a spending review, perhaps at the budget autumn statement. If this is the case, then the Barnett formula is also applied. So long as the new money is new money, it would actually raise the budget of the department in total. If it's simply a switch between budgets, that wouldn't be Barnettable. So for instance, there's one difference though to bear in mind when this happens. The comparability percentage used isn't that of the department, it is that of the individual programme, so these 100% or 0%. So say for instance the UK government decided to spend 100 million more on city deals. So we'd have 100 million for the change to the planned UK government department spending, multiplied by the comparability percentage, which as we'll see here is 100%, whether it's Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, times by the population. So in the case of the population proportion. So in the case of Scotland, this would be worth around £10 million, this £100 million change. So in summary, the Barnett formula determines the annual change in the block grant. It's largely determined at spending reviews, and it is based on changes in UK government departments' budgets, plus these other proportions which are included. I'm going to move on to discuss need, spending per head and convergence. These are three issues which sometimes come up when people are talking about the Barnett formula and also devolved spending in general. So the first thing I've got here is there's no assessment of spending need. So the Barnett formula doesn't take into account the spending needs of the devolved governments. There may be good reasons why different areas need higher levels of spending. For instance, sparse populations might make it more expensive to deliver services, different size of public sector from one devolved government to another, and there may also be higher levels of need in the population and also higher level of demand for services. But Barnett doesn't take these into account. It's very much a mechanical process based on the changes in the UK government departments' budgets. So some people have called, and there's been various committee reports calling for change to the Barnett formula and some sort of need to be taken into account in the process. Another reason that some people have called for this needs-based assessment of the devolved government's budgets is because there are often arguments about spending per head being different across UK government areas. As we can see here, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland see larger spending per head than England, and this is something that causes disagreement sometimes. The rationale that people who want to move to a needs-based assessment is that by doing so, there will be a much better transparency as to why there might be a greater need for higher spending in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. It will give a bit of evidence to why that is the case. So both of these things, the fact there isn't need included and also arguments about spending per head, have led to people suggesting that maybe Barnett should be replaced with a needs-based assessment. It's worth saying another thing here about spending per head, and that is any differences in spending per head between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are unlikely to be a direct result of the Barnett formula itself. And there's some reasons for this. Firstly, spending per head was different in the various government areas before Barnett was ever introduced. Secondly, some spending, when people look at these spending per head figures, some of this spending has nothing to do with the Barnett formula. Some of it's UK government spending on things like welfare, etc. So some of it has nothing to do with Barnett. Lastly, if the Barnett formula holds certain criteria over time, then it should actually lead to convergence in spending per head across the different government areas. So there's a convergence property within Barnett, and I'll come to explain that now. This is often known as the Barnett squeeze. And as I've discussed, the Barnett formula gives countries the same per head increase each year in the block grants. So in theory, if this is happening every year, the same per heads change, the differences should erode over time. Put another way, the percentage increase in the devolved nations spending per head should be smaller than in England because they're already starting from a higher base. So if certain things hold, Barnett in theory should lead to convergence. Now it's very hard to check whether this is happening. There's little data to allow you to make that proper like-for-like comparison simply on the Barnett stuff. There was a commission into public spending in Wales which found some evidence that there was convergence being seen in Welsh spending on services which would have received money via Barnett, essentially. But there are also reasons why this convergence property might not actually happen in reality. Firstly, there's formula bypass. So if funding is provided outside of the Barnett formula and isn't allocated on this kind of per head basis, then it will work against convergence. because everything needs to route through Barnet for convergence to work. Also, population levels can have an effect. There's two reasons or two ways. Firstly, we saw the annual population proportions earlier, the population proportions. If these aren't updated over time, that can lead to convergence not happening, because if you had a population from 10 years ago which wasn't updated, and that was being used now to work out the Barnet formula changes, it wouldn't reflect the actual population level, so that would work against convergence. Equally, even if you are updating annually, and but the absolute level of the population is falling in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, that can work against convergence. The reason for that is, although your annual change will be using the correct population each time, the lower population which you now see will be spread amongst a bigger spending base that was a result of having a higher population in the past. So that works against convergence. So in summary of these issues, there is no needs assessment carried out for Barnet. It's purely mechanical based on changes in the government department spending. Some have called for a new system because of this, and also arguments over spending per head differences between UK government, between devolved governments and the UK government. And also the Barnet formula has a property which could lead to convergence if under certain criteria. So moving on, and lastly, I'm going to speak a little about the future of Barnet, particularly in relation to recent devolution. So we've seen various bits of devolution with the Scotland Act, Scotland Bill, Wales Act, and also Northern Ireland Corporation Tax Act. All of these called for the Barnet formula to remain as the way that the devolved governments received their block grant, or it was calculated. So given that there was a chance for perhaps the Barnet formula to be revamped and it hasn't happened in any of these, it might be fairly safe to say it seems to be here to stay at the moment. What has happened in these devolutions of spending power or tax power, rather than changing the Barnet formula, the block grant itself has been adjusted. So for instance, in a tax, if one of the devolved governments receives a new tax power, the block grant was adjusted downwards to reflect the fact that each devolved government now receives more money and therefore doesn't need as much money from the block grant. In the case of a spending power, the block grant would be adjusted upwards to reflect that the devolved government needs more spending power because it's taken on more services. So this has been the approach. There's no change to Barnet, it's just the block grant, which is changing each year, has been adjusted. The only thing to say aside from that is in the Scotland Bill there is, or certainly the fiscal framework accompanying the Scotland Bill, there is a slight change in the areas that Barnet will be calculating changes on. So as part of the Scotland Bill, Scotland will be receiving more welfare spending powers. And the block grant the Barnet formula will now be determining changes in the revenue provided for spending power, for welfare spending power in Scotland. And this is a departure because welfare spending is annually managed expenditure, which, as I said, wasn't part of the Barnet formula in general. So this is a change. It's not a big change particularly, but it's something worth noting. So in summary of the key points, the Barnet formula calculates changes in the block grant based on UK government departments' changes in their budget. One thing I should say, and I didn't say, is that although the Barnet formula is looking at UK government departments, the block grant, the money that the Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish governments receives as part of those changes doesn't have to be spent on the areas it's been received for. So for instance, if they get 0.1 billion because of education, it doesn't have to be spent on education. It just goes into block grant, which the devolved governments are free to spend as they wish. The Barnet formula is not statutory, it's not laid out in legislation anywhere. The statement of funding policy is the main document driving the policy. There's no assessment of need made in the Barnet formula, which some people have called for changing. However, there seems to be no appetite for the Barnet formula to be changed, and all recent devolution we've seen that the Barnett formula appears to be here to stay. Has anyone got any questions on that? Yep.
I've got two very quick questions. The first one is this question about compatibility.
Yep.
Can it be challenged? Would the Scottish Government look and say, well, actually, we're doing lots of forward for stuff that you're not counting, and therefore that's
It's a Treasury document, the Statement of Funding Policy, where these things are all in. There is some negotiation about it, so it could be challenged in the future. I'm not convinced whether, if it was challenged now, whether that would mean, backdated changes to things, but there's certainly, the Treasury say they consult, so I'm just seeing whether there's anything in here about the right to disagree and what the procedure is, but generally it's Treasury and there is some consultation going on. I could probably get back to you with the exact wording of what it says on any disputes, but...
And the question, so Barnett takes the Department's overall spending
yeah,
and applies a formula to it,
yes,
and from that, do I know you just say Scotland?
yeah.
Does it work on a smaller level? So if you announced transport infrastructure spending in London, let's say Crossrail,
Right, yes.
is it possible to say, well, we spend £20 million on Crossrail, and therefore Scotland or Wales or Ireland get an extra £2 million next year? Does it work at that level?
If there was new funding given to Crossrail outside of the spending review, so if this 20 million or whatever was new funding outside of the spending review, which raised the Department for Transport's budget by the same amount, then you would work out a Barnett consequential. But what you wouldn't do is go through things in the past that are part of the overall budget and say, there was 20 million allocated for this, therefore the Barnett consequential was this, because that's not really the way that government department spending is worked out. It's very much a top-down, you've got this much money.
So the question is, how much of that money for Crossrail is new money?
Yes.
And then from that, let's say it was 16 million,
Yeah.
you could then work out how much.
Yes, providing it was a new thing outside of the spending review. And the other thing to say is that it's comparable, because obviously if it's not comparable, I point at this because that's where the comparabilities are. If it isn't comparable, then there will be no Barnett consequential. You can go through the process, but there won't be. Sorry.
What about the things people talk about as kind of national infrastructure projects? I mean, in here it talks about the Olympics, and originally nothing was going to come from the Olympics, and it evolved. Governments appealed that all that investment in East London should count.
Yeah.
Well, does Crossrail, the London sewers, I mean, my part of Scottish Railway is not connected to the rest.
Right.
Because you have to walk across Glasgow. Well, can we not get a bit of Crossrail money and have our Crossrail, because it's holding money from the region back?
Yes, providing that Crossrail is comparable, then you would. The example of the Olympics was, the Olympics had been decided that it was 0% comparable. It was UK-wide project. However,
who decides that?
the Treasury. The Treasury.
London Olympics. And yet the Glasgow Commonwealth Games, we walk out for ourselves. Yes, exactly.
The Scottish Government has to fund it out of existing.
Yeah, no, I know. That's what I mean. Why did London get a national thing and the Commonwealth Games we had to work?
Well, with the Olympics, the Treasury decided that the Olympics would be a UK-wide project, therefore not Barnettable. However, the devolved governments argued that, hang on, there's housing projects as part of this, there's transport projects as part of this. If you did those projects through the DCLG budget, we would get Barnett for those things. So in the end, the Treasury ended up giving some money to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but yeah, that was the process, and that's an argument which seems to be fair. If it had just been made through the normal procedure, then they would have received that money.
So what about things like Crossrail and the new sewers?
Well,
is it just literally the Treasury can go, we've decided this is a national infrastructure project, even though it's actually a London infrastructure project?
Well, no, it's not whether it's national, that's not the point. It's whether it's UK-wide.
Yeah.
whether it's solely for the for the UK. And I don't think Crossrail is. I think Crossrail is Barnetable. Let me check. I stand to be wrong here, but let's have a look.
I mean, there's always lots of talk about what is defined as what, and
Yeah.
obviously, lots of my constituents will never be in London. So, having new sewers or whatever else.
Yes, yeah,
they
yeah.
Say, well, why am I paying for that?
Let me check for transport.
Pouring into onto the futures. Yeah, no, well, I'm just trying to understand it. What's the mechanism?
Crossrail's 100%. So any spending on Crossrail would get, as long as, as part of the normal process. If there was new Crossrail spending, Barnet consequentials will go to Scotland. So there are,
So can you think of, other than trying it with the Olympics, another,
Kew Gardens, I think, is 0% for that reason.
so they decided that was a national project?
Yes, they decided it was for the UK-wide project. Yes.
I think there's questions about whether the Parliament, whether the refurb Palace of Westminster is going to be part. I think that's a question. Or whether they designate that
I
as
think
a
they'll count that. Definitely.
Infrastructure spend, Heathrow is decided, isn't it? Of which should be some.
It's not clear from this what Heathrow is.
Is an official recourse to appeal if it's decided, if the Treasury decided something is a UK-wide project?
Let me find the paragraph, because that's pretty much the same question that we've had already. Sorry, this is a new one, so I'm not exactly sure where it was. There's certainly some discussion. Sorry.
It's great to have this session because we spent half our lives listening to Barnet.
Right. Comparability.
Sorry, because you've got thinking that.
Change the-
Do you want funding for that?
Resolving disputes. That will probably be the chapter, wouldn't it? So because I know it's changed, the wording of this has changed. All right, here we go. If there is a disagreement between Treasury ministers and devolved administrations about changes in statement, effectively how Barnet works, they can pursue the matter with Treasury ministers. This is the normal procedure for resolving disputes on all financial issues and mirrors the arrangements between the Treasury and the UK departments. The Treasury will consider and respond to any such representation in taking this forward with the relevant party. This is also in line with the process outlined in the Agreement on Dispute Avoidance and Resolution in the Memo of Understanding between the UK Government and devolved administrations. So matters can be raised through the Joint Ministerial Committee after that. Funding policy and public expenditure allocation across the UK as non-devolved or reserved matters remain the responsibility of UK government. So it's a process of ministers in each government talking to Treasury ministers about the process. Yep.
Could you give us your observations on how the current formula will interact with the new methods of calculating the block grant adjustments under the fiscal framework for the Scotland Act, which will come in next year?
Well, Barnet kind of sits aside from the block grant adjustment, so it will still determine how spending per head changes. But the block grant adjustments sit outside of that. I don't know if that helps really, because they are distinct processes.
So they're completely separate. So the block grant adjustment process is used to calculate what the changes to the block grant should be because of revenue being raised in Scotland.
Yeah, the block grant adjustment.
Then you apply Barnet to the bit that's left.
Well, the block grant adjustment is basically working out, say for income tax, how much the initial transfer of income tax will be equal to the amount that the UK government would have expected to raise in Scotland. After that, of course, this needs to change over time because, economic growth, inflation, etc. It wouldn't be right to keep it at the same level. It would be worth too little in the future. So a process of adjusting that happens over time, the indexation. So that happens to Scotland's block grant. Alongside that, the Barnett formula will just carry on working in the background, working out how spending changes by UK government departments affects the block grant. So these changes will all be added together much in the same way as they are for UK government departments. Presumably there will just be an extra line which will be in a negative line, which represents income tax. So that will just go into the mix and be added with all the other changes.
So the revenue raising powers changes themselves shouldn't affect the comparability percent?
No.
Just on the draft plan and spend per head.
Yep.
Is that based on identifiable expenditure as well, or is that?
This must be.
The Olympics and-
It must be identifiable spending because we don't have figures for the other regions which aren't identifiable. So it is identifiable. So it's about 89. So the difference between identifiable and non-identifiable expenditure is that identifiable expenditure can be in some way related to a region or an area. Non-identifiable can't. So the classic example of non-identifiable is defence, because you couldn't say what region's benefiting from defence spending. So these certainly are, will be identifiable. These are Treasury figures, I think.
So
Yeah.
the 38 billion spent on defence
Is not in there.
The majority of that spent South of Birmingham. So
But
that's
there,
not included in that.
the defence, no, wouldn't be included in that. If you want to look at total public spending, then the Scottish Government's GERS, Government Expenditure and Revenue Statistics, makes an assessment of total managed expenditure obviously only in UK and Scotland. It doesn't do Wales or Northern Ireland, but if you want to look at it for total, so 100% of public spending, that's the place to look.
Does GERS then include, if you like, all of the, or is included somewhere else, the additional stuff? I mean, the mere fact that Parliament is here, Whitehall is here, Heads of Department, there's so many things that are just simply in London that come from public money. That wouldn't be in here, or would it be in here?
London public spending, it should be in here. Yeah, it should be in here because it's identifiable to where it is.
If it was being described as national, because obviously this is a national parliament, it's a national treasury, etc., would they then sit outside that, or would they be included? Because that's one of the issues as well. I mean, they're just this is just such a centre that pools a lot. It still benefits the economy.
Spend and value, this is a book in the GBA impact of what's already here, whereas the subtackle spend.
Yeah. I'm fairly sure that these sorts of things you mentioned would be included in London. They're public spending in London. It's identifiable that they are happening in London. I don't see why they wouldn't be. I can double check that for you if you like.
Yeah, because I think that, obviously the issue of things that are described as national, as with the Olympics, not bringing barred consequences from them. I just wonder whether this would only be things that are considered as having an influence in the block grant. And obviously part of our argument is, there sure is not the same public spend in Glasgow as there is here. That is public, at least it's started by public money, because it's all the orbiting circles of government and things that connect.
When we're thinking about identify and non-identify in this respect, it's not necessarily talking about Barnet UK-wide projects and things like that. It's very much, is this public spending that we can say was made in this particular region?
If you could.
But I can find out,
All the things that are publicly supported here, the opera, the museums, all the rest of it.
Yeah.
It still goes into the economy.
Yeah, I can get back to you on that.
That would be really helpful. If you look at recent governments in there's been a general, also vague trend to devolve spending away from Westminster. So Greater Manchester's got a lot of control of the health budgets, the whole northern part house transport for the north, then will we have some kind of spending
Yeah.
with it? Presumably that spending will also have some sort of formula in it. What would it take? Because I'm guessing the grant given to Greater Manchester Health Authority will have to change year on year as well. So is there a broader formula 2050 those things? And I suppose in the longer term, is this the telling you to broader formula for spending in each region?
I'm afraid I
Or
can't.
needs-based assessment?
Yeah, I
So
can't.
those are very big questions.
No, I understand the point. I can't say myself because unfortunately I don't. Devolution to cities and those things isn't something I cover, I'm afraid. I know in the first instance they would have just been devolved the amount of spending that the UK government was going to make, but then after that, you're quite right. I don't know what the process is for uprating that spending over time. I mean, local government itself. Well, she doesn't anymore. Used to have a needs-based, I mean, it's kind of aside, but that used to have a needs-based formula. That doesn't really anymore. But that's not quite the same as an answering your question. But I can speak to our devolution expert who could get back to you on that. Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Yes. Yes, yeah. Yes. No, I'm afraid I don't know, but if you leave me your name at the end, I can get one of my colleagues to get back to you on that.
Taking account of geography and deprivation, which are probably or age, geography and deprivation
Yes.
might be the three big things that make public services
Mm,
more expensive to deliver or much higher demand in them. Has that work been done? See how much it would actually change? I mean, certainly in Scotland we have a really challenging geography for something like health that I deal with, and obviously a lot of deprivation.
Yes.
There will be other places they're quite well off, but they have an elderly population.
Yes,
So
yeah.
within England, the kind of regional thing. So is that been looked at?
That piece of work, certainly on a government basis, hasn't been carried out since 70-something, I think. Maybe early 80s, but there was certainly some attempt to have a look at, okay, what does each government region need to spend or stuff like that.
Just on that specific point, the Scottish Affairs Committee is about to embark on a report on the demography of Scotland, so that will at least explain our demographics, if not actually what it means. But there has been various committees in House that looked at needs-based formulas, but the one, for example, the House Lords Committee looked at needs-based formula, but it didn't, as far as I'm aware, take into account rurality. So it took into account age, for example, but it didn't take into account how rural Scotland is, which is totally bizarre to me. There have been some people who looked at, if we're going to scrap the Barnett formula, what are we going to use?
Yeah.
But none of it, to my mind, has been accurate.
I mean, I would have thought those are the three obvious pillars, which
Yeah.
is age, deprivation and drug.
Yeah, exactly.
There is some discussion, the note which was at the back, about the various committees who have said stuff about introducing a needs-based formula, but certainly the government itself, I'm sure, hasn't done anything since the 70s or 80s. But they did find that there are clearly different needs across the UK. Trying to think of the report itself, but I can add that when I get back to you on the spending per head stuff.
What do other countries use?
Sorry?
Well, do other countries have, like say Germany, for example, would have a federal system, which do block grants to the states to do things, I'm guessing. So doing some kind of voluntary formula, or...
Well, firstly, those areas often have more revenue raising power. Beyond that, I don't know a great deal, I'm afraid, again. I haven't done any comparisons in the past. There may be stuff in the committee reports which are mentioned in the note at the back, but I can't say myself, beyond knowing that these states generally have bigger revenue raising powers, how the difference is made up, if there indeed is a difference. Anyone else? Oh, thank you for coming. And if anyone has got any other questions, then come up and I'll get back to you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Cheers.